I've had this red oak slab, cookie, whatever you want to call it, laying on my wood rack behind my workshop for the past 2 years. So I decided it was finally time to take it into my workshop and make it into a coffee table. First thing I had to do was get out my flattening jig. There's a link to a video in the description below of how I made this one, but basically it's just a rack that your router can ride back and forth on with a giant bit in the bottom of it. And then you can lower your bit 1/8 of an inch at a time, removing 1/8 of an inch. When you're flattening your first side, you're going to want to stick some wedges underneath whatever you're flattening so it doesn't rock back and forth on your workbench. Once you have the first side flattened, you can flip it over like you can see right here, and it should sit perfectly flat on your workbench now. Now you have a flat side to reference off of while you flatten out your other side. And as you can see right there, I took a chunk out of the side of this slab because I had my router set on plunge and accidentally plunged down. Easy fix though, I'm just going to use my angle grinder with the carving wheel on it to go ahead and carve a nice rounded edge all the way around this entire slab. Once I had that done, I put a sanding disc on my angle grinder and went around and smoothed everything out. I don't know why I didn't just do simple classic bow ties. Honestly, it probably would have looked better and it definitely would appeal to more people, but something in my heart told me I had to do a pretzel. Here's a photograph of a pretzel at a banquet with Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus in the 12th century. Hortus del Colerium. The German word pretzel may be derived from the Latin
braccioli,
which means little arms.
I am braccioli.
I drew it out the best I could on this piece of golden oak and then brought it over to my bandsaw and started cutting it out. It's a 1/4 inch bandsaw blade, which is not ideal for cutting out something with this much detail, but I was able to make it work. And I had to cut it apart on the bottom, but that's alright because I'm going to be gluing it in. I was able to use my jigsaw to just finish cutting that piece apart because I couldn't make the turn with this bandsaw blade. Once I had it all cut, I brought it over to my rotary sander, gave it a quick sand, and then I could trace it onto the top of this tabletop. After that came the really hard part, which was routing this out. I grabbed my router and just went for it. I'd been borrowing my friend's router for like the past 6-7 years. Thanks, Brian. And he recently needed it back. No problem at all. I had this router as a backup, but the only thing I hate about this router that I learned is there's no light on it. So it is really hard to see what you're routing out unless you shine a light directly at it, and even with that it was kind of hard. So I had a hard time staying in the lines. No problem though, I did the best I could. I covered this in glue, hammered down the pretzel, then took my angle grinder with 60 grit sandpaper and sanded the shit out of this thing. I wanted to see what this tabletop would look like if I didn't bother to stain it, and I just sealed it, so I had to get it wet. And since I didn't have any water out in the shop to use to get it wet, what goes better with pretzels than beer? I thought it looked pretty cool, but you could definitely see all the mistakes I made when routing this out. So I knew I'd be staining this to hide some of that. I took some sawdust and glue and filled in the gaps the best I could. I was definitely not happy with this when I was done. So I have this little tiny router bit that comes to a fine point, and then I use this to route out the inside lines of my pretzel. I filled those with sawdust and wood glue, sanded the whole thing back, and there's what I ended up doing. I took a paint pen and traced around all the lines of this pretzel, and before you turn this video off, don't worry, I sanded it all back and you could barely tell, but it did hide the lines really well. As you can see there, I used a paint pen to do salt on the pretzel for a second there, but I hated that, and thankfully it all sanded off while I was working on this table. I gave the whole thing a coat of black stain, and then I decided to do one more thing that I thought would give it a little bit of pop, and I routed out a drip coming off of the pretzel. I took some epoxy and some cumin and mixed it together and poured it into the drip, but as it dried it started to turn orange, so I quickly decided to remove that, and then I tried mixing a tiny little bit of paint with epoxy, and It just didn't want to set up at all. Then I decided I was going to have to carry this entire table down into my basement. Although this thing was pretty heavy, I was able to use my
braccioli,
and carry it down. I painted the drip yellow, and then I took some mustard powder and mixed it with epoxy and poured that on top of this drip. Filled that in, it dried. I came out the next day, sanded it all flat and flush, nice and smooth. Gave everything a nice coat of black stain again on top. Sanded that back a little bit just to give it a rough look so you could see the pretzel a little bit more, but not see all those terrible lines that I did. And then I sealed the whole thing with boiled linseed oil. I originally planned to make legs for this table, but to be honest, I don't really like it that much. So I decided to throw these hairpin legs on it and call it done. So there you go. There's a table I made that was fun to make. I enjoyed it, but I'm not a huge fan of it, and it's probably just going to sit in my barn for the next 10 years. Later. See you in the next one. Hi. I'm interrupting real quick. I finally ordered some shirts. I've been selling them locally just to see how they would sell. I have a bunch left, but not a ton. There's an email address down in the description of this video. You can send me an email on there if you're interested in a shirt anywhere in the United States. It's $27. That includes shipping and everything. I only use Venmo, so if that's something you're comfortable doing, you can send me your size and your address and I will ship one out for you. If you're anywhere outside of the United States, you can send me your address and I can go find out how much it's going to cost and let you know. So check out email down in the bottom and let me know if you're looking for one of these sweet, sweet shirts.
Bye, see you again, and have a good dream.